Okay, good morning, everybody. It takes just a moment to get everybody woven in to this webinar, so we're just going to give it a second before we get going. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning. I'm just watching the numbers on the screen as they change. So good morning, everybody. This is a meeting of the Maine Climate Council. We're so glad you're joining us on Zoom. The folks you see on the screen here are members of the Maine Climate Council, and we also have some co-chairs of the working group here on the screen that you can see. Thanks everybody else who's joining us as participants today. We are doing this on Zoom, which has some efficiencies. It's not as easy for some things. So appreciate everyone doing the usual good Zoom thing of keeping yourself on mute. And thanks everyone for keeping your cameras on if you can. I think it's good. We'll be dropping slides periodically so we can see each other a little bit better. All right, so why don't we get going? I think we're gotten everybody woven in. And I'll turn it over to your co-chairs, Hannah Pingree and Melanie Loisem. Hannah, you gonna take it away?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, everybody. Just a reminder for those of you who weren't with us last week, we are trying to narrow down on a plan that we can all feel good about. Our agenda today, let me show the next slide, is very quick reminders of where we are from Melanie and I. We're going to talk about the revisions that the Climate Council suggested at last week's meeting. We're going to give you an update on the modeling and the targets based on our work with our modeling consultants and the discussion on targets. And then we're going to hopefully hear any final feedback and move this to the next stage. First of all, I just want to again thank the Climate Council for their really helpful engagement over the last couple of weeks. We've had many of you reading this with a fine-tooth comb. Molly, maybe take it to the next slide. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the revisions that were suggested at the last meeting and have been made by staff. So I'm going to again, many of you sent very specific edits. I'm not going to go through each one of those. I will say the staff did incorporate many of the helpful wordsmithing things, but we are trying today to kind of agree on a consensus of where we are. Just moving my chat here. There we go. So to Gary and others, I will say we've continued to edit for clarity, conciseness, and active language. Gary made a very helpful comment about the words that we use and making them more active and specific. So we are not able to do that in every portion and strategy, but I think there's been some good tightening of the language. We have shared kind of based on a broad discussion we had about messaging and how does this climate plan help reflect the situation Maine is in, the urgency we feel, especially around preparing for storms and resilience, the work that's been done on equity to ensure that this plan really reaches all sectors of the population in our state. So we've added a couple of sections. We've added climate impacts, which really speak to the science. We've added a goals section with the kind of 4 themes of this plan and starting to get into the detail about those themes. And we've added an implementation chapter. The implementation chapter is where you all and the public will find the targets that we're agreeing on today, the metrics and details that came out of the modeling. That implementation chapter speaks also to funding. It speaks to an idea that Dan Kleben really pushed in the last meeting was more creative thinking and urgency around finance opportunities for climate, that we need to think more broadly about how we pay for these recommendations that we put in the plan. So that's a lot of content. And I will just say that you've seen a draft last night. It will continue to be copy edited. So don't worry about any remaining typos. There may still be revisions just for clarity of language, but we will not change any content or recommendations. So that's a big picture, and I think it does reflect a lot of thoughtful conversation about the need to message this, and make sure that both policymakers and the Maine public can understand what's in this plan. Um, I think we've said this a couple of times, but when this plan comes out in, um, let's see, about a month, or less, it will include, as you know, pictures, stories, uh, quotes, a lot more sort of color and narrative to help people understand all the good things that have been happening, to sort of help emphasize strategies, help see what's happened over the last 4 years. So that does really help enhance the plan and make it more interesting and readable. We have a lot of words in this plan, a lot of strategies, but the stories of how the last plan was implemented across communities in Maine, successes we've had, stories of Maine people, quotes help a lot. So that will be added to the plan. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the specific areas where we talked about last week, and then that you should see reflected in the plan. So we did update strategy A, transportation, and added a fair amount of detail about rail and efforts that are underway with both Maine DOT and the New England Passenger Rail Authority. We got a lot of public comment around rail, and there is a lot of activity happening to improve both freight and passenger rail service in Maine. So we wanted to reflect that. In buildings, we had I'd say, a fairly robust conversation about both building code adoption, stretch codes, contractors, and how we help both certify and license specific types of contractors to ensure that they are meeting the energy codes that the climate plan calls for. So I may hit up Matt Marks, Michael Stoddard. I know Kathleen and Gary all had kind of a side conversation around that, and I appreciate the back and forth. So we were trying to strengthen and clarify that language, and also speak to, I think, some of the contractors' concerns about how the language that we use and making sure it's precise. Next slide.
And Hannah, I'll just say when we want to, we can actually look at the latest version of that language, which is even, I think, a little bit more updated than what went out, but I'll double check that.
Okay. Um, Clean energy, we had a very significant conversation around affordability, reliability, the impacts of our strategies on costs and on communities. I think the Climate Council, a variety of members brought that forward, and we did strengthen that language. I think the climate plan throughout speaks to the need for affordability to make all of our strategies work. So we did want to respond to that. Um, we added a little bit more in the job section around career pathways and K through 12 education. That came from the Department of Education and some of the workforce folks involved. Um, we got a couple different suggestions on the natural working land section, just to make it very specific and clear the kinds of strategies we put in around different types of lands, and as well as the need for funding, not just for Land for Maine's Future, but other programs. So we added more detail back there. Again, that wasn't really a substantive change. The working group's reports were very robust. They got boiled down into the climate plan. And I think a number of folks felt like some of that detail needed to be in the plan. People across Maine read it, they need to understand the detail. So we added more detail back. On resilience, we got CDC suggested some more aggressive, not aggressive, but clear language and proactive language around public health, both following disasters and vector-based disease monitoring. So we clarified that. There's a lots in the resilience chapter, as you all know. So we did continue to just clarify the land use language and the material management recommendations. I think there's no perfect solution. The resilience chapter is still quite significant. We put a lot of the things in there that are relevant to communities. So it's still a heavy one. I think Melissa and a couple folks spoke to that, but we did try to just clarify and combine. And on the engagement with Maine People chapter, again, we just added a little bit more language about schools. Next slide. So I think with that, I don't know, David, if anybody, I would say that the sort of most robust group of people who talked to each other were the folks who worked on the building code and contractor issues. I don't know if any of them want to comment just to make sure that we're all good there. Before we go to Melanie and talking about mission reductions, it would be helpful to bring that up. We've had a couple other, I would say, minor and positive suggestions for additions. Dan Brennan had a suggestion about 3D printed houses and the good work happening there that he was hoping to add. So I'll ask him to specifically bring that up. Again, we don't want to add anything to the climate plan without making sure you're all in the loop. So I don't know, David, do you want to talk building codes first and then we'll go to Dan?
Yeah, I think let's take a pause before we go to targets and sit with these changes just for a moment. You'll notice in the document that was circulated, there was a little placeholder on the building codes piece saying we'll deal with that day of, like game day. There's been a lot of back and forth, and there is a new version. I'm just going to share my screen for 1 second, Molly, if you want to drop yours, and I'll go ahead and share mine. And this is the final text, and I'll ask Michael and Matt and others that have been working on this. We can just sit here for 1 second. This is how it looks right now. Again, this is in the building section on the code adoption piece. So you can see how it reads right now, that it says commit to timely adoption and robust training on new building codes to reach net zero carbon emissions for new construction in Maine by 2035, with the interim goal of defining a pathway to reach net zero emissions codes by 2028. Move responsibly for building code adoption, compliance, and responsibility, training to the state, from the state fire marshal's office to the new Office of Community Affairs. And then this one got some updates as well. Support contractors and code enforcement officers through training, technical assistance, particularly in small and rural communities, and evaluate the benefits and feasibility of contractor certification or licensing, and establishing a consistent level of education and compliance with Maine's energy code across the building community. So I'll just, Matt or Michael and or others who are involved in this redraft, anything to say just about how you're feeling about it at this point?
David, I'm happy to jump in. From a contractor perspective, I think this works well. It helps keep the universal code. Moving over to MoCA is a giant leap, and I applaud that. And I think the training and education and evaluation of that is terrific. So I don't have any questions about this, but I'm happy to, if others do, I'm happy to provide any feedback about that from our perspective.
Thanks, Matt. And just quick, Michael, anything else on this?
No, that's it. I mean, we were really down into little nuances and wordsmithing. So I think I appreciate everyone at the last minute playing along and focusing their attention on that. Hopefully, this is not a very significant change. It was minor wordsmithing, and I feel pretty comfortable with it. I'm hopeful that did as well.
Great. Thanks, both. All right. So that's that. And I just showed it because it was one of the bigger changes. Dan?
Yeah, thank you very much. In section B4, where we're talking about promoting the manufacture and use of climate-friendly building products. Number one, it's very well written. I think it's great. The first paragraph talks about, we can reduce embodied carbon emissions, wood fiber insulation, designing buildings. My comment is we're actually doing this, and didn't know if we wanted to give recognition to the work done at the University of Maine with the building of BioHome 3D, which is a wood-based actual home that's been constructed. And to that extent, even maybe HP timber, because those are two things that we've actually done. And I didn't know if there was a way to just acknowledge that. I don't feel strongly one way or the other, but I didn't want to finalize this without having that conversation about the work that is actually being done that supports the wording that's in this section. So just thought I would bring it up.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate, and this is what Hannah mentioned. This is sort of a comment that came in like very recently. We don't have it in the draft right now, but the specific suggestion from Dan is let's do a shout out to some of the specific things that are happening in Maine in this front, the 3D printing happening at UMaine and or other things. So that would be a sentence that finds its way somewhere into this section 4.
And I would just say, I think, please anybody object, but assuming people don't have a problem with that, we'll probably put it in the language of the paragraphs versus the actual recommendations. And I think, Dan, it's a good comment. I do think we mentioned timber HP in the jobs and economy section. So I think that I can't remember if the 3D printed house is in there, but we're happy to add it. And especially the fact that Maine Housing is doing a specific project and helping to fund that work. I think that is what we would mention. So
Thank you.
Great. Gary, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, either that or you could do a little dialogue box and not have it as a bullet point and part of the content and just a little heads up.
yeah, I
Right.
like that, Gary. I mean, Dan, are you and others good if we include it, some mention sort of featuring it in this section?
Yeah. However it makes sense.
That's great. Okay. Dan Burgess?
Thanks, David. So back up to the changes. I think they're generally pretty good. I think in the text we, suggested that we make sure that, there's a number of entities kind of working on kind of training and contractor work across, and want to make sure that's in, I think it's in the text in coordination with us and then others that will do that. So that's obvious, but wanted to flag that. And then I don't know if you guys talked about it in the subgroup or not, but the timeliness of the energy code isn't always up to us, and so I think maybe it doesn't need to be reflected in the wording, but we should just be aware that the energy code lately has been not the fastest at the national level to come out, and so just I think recognition of that a little bit in our as we think about what we're updating when the nationals update theirs. So
Okay. Thanks, Dan. I think that's helpful context, and maybe that finds its way in as context, or maybe it's just helpful for us to say it. Yeah. Okay. Kathleen?
I think that we capture that at the bottom of page 28 in the text, not the bullets, that just about the when the new code is released, that's what starts the clock on our adoption.
Great. Excellent. Okay. All right. So that was code, and that was Dan Brennan's suggestion of getting somehow in there, maybe in a call out box or something, the good work that's happening already on the innovation space. I think those were the two that I know I wanted to make sure we flag before we jump into the targets. I will say, however, if a climate counselor would like 2-3 minutes to dive into the section of the document you cared most about and wanted to see the change, I'm happy to have a little bit of reading time right now, because you got this just yesterday. If folks need a tiny bit of reading time to go in there, I'm happy to take that pause before we jump into the targets conversation. But just flag it, like absolutely, like, hey, can you just give me 2 minutes? I'm gonna go check out how that thing is written, if you didn't get a chance to do that already. So feel free to shout out and ask for that if you want it. I'll just be quiet for a second and see if anybody needs that. People feeling like they have eyes on sufficiently?
David, this climate council is on the ball. They've ready.
Seriously, I love it. Okay. All right. So with that, why don't we bring the slides back up, and Melanie can walk us through the work that's happened over the last few days. Yeah.
sorry, I thought we were just talking about the building section edit.
I was talking about all the edits that have been done before we dive into the targets world. Yeah.
Okay, I have two, just probably one minor and then one I just want to make sure I understand. So page 29, I think it talks about some federal funding, and I would want to know if folks are okay with us. I think there's new federal funding successes that we could highlight beyond what was in there before. And I think those are minor kind of wordsmithing, but want to make sure if we suggested a few edits there, that would be okay. Seeing heads now.
Some edits to signal that there's additional federal funding available?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's assume that happens. And again, we're going to do a check-in in a moment. Folks are comfortable with the whole package, but let's assume that goes in. That seems like a reasonable thing. Yeah. And was there something else, Dan Burgess?
The discussion around thermal networks on page 14 says study and deploy. I think, we want to get rid of language that is not, consider or support or otherwise, but wondering if we want to ourselves, I think the studying part's really important. How, where would a thermal network be cost effective? And then there's the how it gets deployed. And I didn't know if we wanted to add another word or process there in some way.
So you would want something that says something along the lines of study the benefits and costs of thermal energy networks and decarbonize district heats and how they would be deployed, something like that?
Yeah, or where, and then the deployment of something like that would take, I think, considerable work to kind of figure out who and how and what. So I didn't want to just kind of leave it hanging as deploy them if it's cost effective.
Okay. Any concerns with some massaging of that, Michael Stoddard?
No, I share that. I share that idea. There may be multiple things that are cost effective, and you wouldn't just want to be mandated to then proceed and make that the selection when there might be some. We don't, just because it's cost effective doesn't mean it's the most cost effective. And there might be other options that people would prefer. But I think the studying is what needs to happen first, so we can have some sense of that. They are being piloted in other states, and those results could tell us a lot. But it would probably be, yeah, I agree with Dan's general thrust there. They're very complex and pretty expensive, so it's not something you wouldn't just say, you wouldn't just, it's a pretty big decision. So I would agree that it would be useful to have a little additional process referenced.
Okay. That seems reasonable. Does anybody have concerns if there's a few words added to that phrase to get at what Michael and Dan are talking about? I was not intending to go into substance right now and negotiate this, but it's okay. Folks are bringing stuff up. I wanted to make sure that people had a sense that they had a chance to actually get eyes on the changes. Does anybody feel like
I will say if folks are okay with what Dan and Michael just suggested to clarify that language, that makes sense. Dan's suggestion about federal grants, I'm kind of confirming with the entire Climate Council, you don't have an issue if we add additional funding the state has received. We are waiting for the outcome of next week's bond votes. Those things, several of those are relevant to Climate Council work, so we'll mention those if they pass, the Trails bond as well as the R&D bond. So just FYI, those are also impactful. So
thanks. Amanda?
I have a process question. Will we have an opportunity to make suggestions for some minor language tweaks at any other point in time? Because I think a couple of us are just seeing some things in the section E that we haven't had a chance to put our heads together on.
So what we're going to do today in this meeting is agree on the content. If there is wordsmithing that's essentially like copy editing to make it clearer, that's fine. But what we don't want to do is make any substantive changes after our call today. So if it's, Amanda, like, it's not really clear. Like if you said it this way, it'd be clearer what we mean. Great. If it's like, actually, I need to add in these 3 things that didn't, they're somewhat substantive, not working. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but by the the end of this meeting, if we have that figured out, we can.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. Pat?
Yes, there's just a dramatic emerging issue. Timing is everything, but the spruce budworm is back, and it's up in the Northern Territory, and we're seeing it uh, infest that northwest part of the state, and it'll have implications for carbon storage of trees and maybe not enhance in a good way, the threat of fire. So I don't know if you just want a placeholder in there because this is a quickly emerging issue, or if you just want to say we missed 2.0 and it'll be in 3.0. I just kind of guarantee it's going to be a big issue this in the next couple of months as we talk about it more and more.
Pat, I'm just looking maybe at Amanda, and we have got her co-chair Tom also on. Is there any concern with adding some narrative around concern for pests and forest health with some detail that Pat just mentioned?
Well, let's, I guess it would depend on the language, Pat, and how much you want to suggest that we can consider.
I don't think at this point, I'd just feel funny if you went forward without having the word spruce budworm in the report somewhere. And it could be a very minor mention as an emerging issue that we'll be dealing with that has implications for carbon storage and the health of our forests. If you think that would be of value or not, I just didn't want this group to all of a sudden be hearing about this and understanding it has implications, but I don't know how to deal with it in the report. I'm just flagging it.
Yeah, I guess okay, yeah, same. And there's a lot there in those few words, and so I just want to make sure that we're not, creating a situation. I think I just don't want to be premature about it, I guess.
Yep, I gotcha. And you can understand, I just don't want to be silent about it either. But just if we said something like, we're watching a developing issue on the Western Front. I don't know, something like that.
Amanda, go ahead.
Well, I don't have the entire chapter memorized, although I've read it a couple of times, but for strategy E, I feel like we did make some mention toward pests and diseases and maybe even invasives. And I don't know that we did any other for instances, but I guess it wouldn't hurt to have a couple of examples. I might broaden it to more than one if we're just giving for instances.
Yeah, this is a material development, though. There are trees that are defoliated right now, and to the tune of 2,000 or 3,000 acres. So
I understand what you're saying, Pat. I also think that we can expect that we will face other significant issues like that, situations like that across the board, and it's hard to predict. So I think if we give some examples as examples, that's not saying that's the totality of what we're talking about.
Okay.
Does that feel like it's in the spirit of what we've heard from the group, the working group?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Why don't we sort of work on a couple of words, kind of offline here, and then bring them back, to meet David's time requirement.
Right. But I will only say the time is today.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the question for the rest of the Climate Council do you feel okay with Tom, Amanda, maybe in consultation with Pat, adding some such as with pests and concerning concerns for the forest health as just examples.
Matt Marks?
I'm fine with it. Sorry, I was just trying to say yes.
Okay, nice. All right.
I was hitting the wrong button.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, folks. All right. So, all right. One of you's texted me about a question around targets and things. So let's hold off if you have other questions around targets until we get there. I would say let's go into the target conversation now, and then we're going to circle back and look at the totality of what we're doing and test our comfort level. And I appreciate you all throwing up a few key issues right now that are on your top of mind for you. That was helpful. This goes over to Melanie, and Molly, if you could pop, there you go. Great.
All right, we finally ready for this?
I think we're going for it. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to give everybody a quick recap and then walk through some minor adjustments, fortunately, to what we presented to you already in terms of targets we've worked on with our modelers. So a quick reminder for this update to Maine Won't Wait. Evolved energy research analyzed future scenarios for Maine's greenhouse gas emissions. They've modeled different pathways for reductions that they predict will meet our 2030 and 2050 gross greenhouse gas emission goals. There's always some uncertainty in projections and models, but despite that, they are still a useful tool for estimating the quantitative impacts of different strategies. So let's get into the 2030 targets on the next slide. So the targets on this slide show a potential pathway that aligns with the strategies proposed by the Council for this updated plan to meet our 2030 statutory emission goals. As with similar modeling that we did in 2020, it does show a transition over time to a largely electrified transportation and building sectors, combined with the transition to a clean energy electricity sector. Based on our discussions last week, we did ask the consultants to test different scenarios that would be achievable for Maine. The most realistic of those options is what's presented here. We have removed the hydrogen-derived fuel from the model in 2030 in recognition that that would be very challenging to achieve in the near term. But to compensate for that adjustment, you'll see that we have increased the target for EVs, but only slightly from 135,000 to 150,000 by 2030. And just as a reminder, that's still quite a bit lower than what we had in the 2020 plan, which was 219,000 EVs. Next slide, Molly. So now let's take a look at 2050. In the 2050 case, hydrogen is still going to be an important clean energy option for us. As technology costs decline and green hydrogen becomes more prevalent, hydrogen is predicted to become a more reasonable alternative for the hard to electrify applications like medium and heavy duty vehicles and certain industrial processes. As we approach 2050, there are still going to be uses of liquid fuels like aviation that are going to be really difficult to electrify, and hydrogen is going to play an important role in providing clean fuels for those uses. Those markets, as you know, are still in development, and we can't be certain at this stage which fuels are going to rise to the top as the most economic and feasible for 2050. Again, these are models, these are estimates. We're trying to make predictions, and in 2024, when we're talking about 2050, a lot of this involves a fair amount of assumptions and guesswork. However, we know that meeting Maine's emission targets are going to be far more difficult if Maine does not plan for advancements in fuel and energy supplies. The model also for 2050 does assume an incremental downward trajectory in emissions from our industrial sector, which would be consistent with the historical trends we've already seen that are due to market changes, co-pollutant benefits from standards that restrict emissions of other pollutants, which also have the effect of reducing CO2 emissions, as well as changes in fuels. We're also seeing increased electrical generation from renewable sources that will help to continue to reduce emissions from the electricity generating sector. And with that, I just ask if Dan Burgess has anything he'd like to add.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. I appreciate that overview. I wanted to touch briefly on the electricity sector and our efforts to ensure reliable, affordable, clean electricity available to all consumers in the state. In order to do that, we need to account for regional electricity production and market dynamics. We share a grid with the other New England states, and so both in-state and regional clean energy resources are important to achieving our goals and targets. As this group knows, our RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the standards that we have ensure that electricity that is consumed in Maine will continue to become cleaner over time, which relies on both in-state and regional generation sources. And the Northeast region has a long-standing, robust mechanism for measuring and attributing clean electricity attributes through different portfolio standards. We've, through some of these processes, looked at some of the emerging inconsistencies in regional accounting frameworks, which may lead to risks of under or double counting by jurisdictions with similar policy goals. And so our emissions accounting should ensure that GHG reductions resulting from our RPS or our electricity consumption are fully and fairly attributed to Maine. So ensuring Maine's approach is transparent and aligned with others in the region will maximize benefits of Maine policies and enable continued cost-effective clean electricity deployment and adoption in the state while working across the region on that. And so a brief note on the electricity sector and some of the new information in the report. So back to you, Melanie.
Dan, and what Dan just described, I think you'll see reflected in the energy chapter, where we've added some language since our last meeting to try to recognize that interrelationship with our neighboring states and how that connects to electrical services and what that means for greenhouse gas emissions, both in the state and regionally. So just to be clear, the targets in this scenario we know are ambitious, and they are particularly for 2050 dependent on advancements in technology to make them affordable for Mainers. However, we do think at this point that it is still within the realm of what we could accomplish with an ongoing commitment to reduce Maine's impact on global greenhouse gas levels. And then we do also have some other targets that we did spend a fair bit of time discussing at our last meeting that I think Hannah is going to go through with us now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Dan. So just a reminder for the next slide, we talked about, so what Melanie just showed on the screen were sort of very directly tied to exactly what the modelers told us we needed to do to meet our requirements in law. Some of the targets that we have proposed here are existing and continuing from the last climate plan, and some of them are new. They do reflect what the modeling has told us, but they also reflect lots of our conversations we've had about ensuring benefits for low-income households, for disadvantaged communities. So just a reminder, that's where a lot of this conversation has come from. So we talked about these last week. I know specifically Michael and others who helped to implement these programs at Maine Housing, the Governor's Energy Office, have really thought about the cost implications and how we would fund these programs, making sure we have both ambitious goals, but also realistic goals. So heat pumps in low-income households, we've set a goal of 40,000 by 2030. Just a reminder that we have a goal of 15,000 by 2025. So this would be continuing the pace, assuming we achieve that target next year, but ramping up our ambition in the next 5 years. Low-income homes weatherized, we've continued with the 10,000 by 2030. We set a new target of new or renovated clean and energy efficient affordable housing units, and we've set a goal of 1,500 per year. Maine Housing has really focused on what's achievable. This is ambitious in new housing units produced, and also ambitious in retrofitted affordable housing units. So we wanted to reflect the tremendous federal funding we've received and that Maine is really focusing on this sector. But just to be clear, these are exciting and ambitious goals. We talked about the percent of EV rebate funding to low and moderate income households. Just want to clarify that this is a target for light duty EVs. So our goal is 50% of the funding going to these households each year. Percentage of climate infrastructure and resilience investments in disadvantaged communities. We've talked a lot about this. We've put a target of 40%. So this is for programs like the Community Resilience Partnership Program or the Maine Infrastructure Adaptation Fund. LMI households with rooftop solar and or enrolled in community solar projects. We spent a little time on this goal. The goal is still 15,000 by 2030. This reflects the opportunity that we have with the Solar for All funds coming to the state of Maine, which require the majority of benefits to go to low-income households. I think there was a good conversation in the Climate Council about making sure that this didn't adversely impact other ratepayers, and that's where some of the additional affordability language was added to the energy chapter. Next slide. I don't think any of these have changed since last week. So publicly funded EV charging ports, 700 by 2028. This reflects the significant federal funding we have and the progress we're making. Renewable energy use in Maine by 2030. Again, these are all targets for 2030. They're interim targets that we are going to continue to try to track and report on. So there's still the 100% clean energy goal by 2040. But we just continue to focus on 80% by 2030 for renewable electricity. Clean energy jobs created. We're adding this to the plan. This was a goal set by the governor, and adding the new goal of 7,000 registered apprentices by 2030, just reflecting the opportunities in lots of sectors, but especially the clean energy sector and the need for registered apprenticeships to help train all the workers that we need to do all the things that we've included in this climate plan. So I think that is it. But I don't think this is radically different, but this does reflect the conversation we had last week, and the both trying to be ambitious, ensure equity, but also be realistic about the funding that we have and will need in the coming years.
Thanks, Han.
So David, passing it back to you.
Yeah. So why don't we just take a deep breath on this? That's a lot of numbers and things. And I'm curious if if anybody has a question, particularly about anything that feels different than last time. Again, there was some work done with the modelers, some minor differences in those that Melanie showed. Now we have these ones that Hannah just showed. Does anybody have any questions about this? Anything that's not clear for folks? Kate?
I don't know if this is not clear, so I don't know if I'm answering your question, David.
Go right ahead.
Okay.
It's all good.
Whomever is driving the slideshow, could we go back to Melanie's first slide on the 2030 targets? So thanks, DEP, for increasing that target for EVs to 150. It does still seem like we've come really far down, and that the modeling just, in the immediate, it's not going to get us there. And so it feels like this is the place to aspire, and especially with all the added language on robust education, pointing towards larger uptake and the great infrastructure plans for rural charging. So I don't know, David, for me, it's really, is this a fall on my sword moment? Probably not. And like, this feels like, since this is a place to aspire a bit higher.
Right.
So it's a reflection.
Right. So if we're up to you, you would put a higher number. Yeah. Got it. Melanie?
I might just note, if we want to flip to 2050 real quick, talking about Inspire. So we know, so if you sort of go back and forth between the two slides, it says number of light duty EVs on the road, right? So this isn't just the number of vehicles that need to be sold in that year moving forward. This is about fleet turnover. And so, I mean, we're looking at still a pretty aggressive fleet turnover that we would be proposing needs to happen by 2030 to meet our goals. And then 2050, it takes about 10 to 15 years to do a light duty fleet turnover. So to reach this goal for 2050, we're looking at a very significant change in the fleet that's going to happen pretty quickly post 2030. So, okay, I totally hear you. I would just say that I think that this is, this is a ramp up to a very significant change in the kind of light duty vehicles that we would see on the road in Maine, and also aligns roughly with what we would estimate that we would get out of some of the other, the other regulatory mechanisms that have been considered in other states, and definitely goes above and beyond the EPA default. So that was one of the things that we had worked on with the modelers, is trying to make sure that we understood that what we were plugging into the model went beyond what we would now consider the baseline, which is those EPA standards that have gone into effect for light duty vehicles. So this is taking us above and beyond sort of what has now become the new federal baseline. So I don't know if that helped, but I'd say when you look at the 2050 numbers and you think about the rate of fleet turnover, this is still going to be a really significant change in our fleet over the next couple of decades.
Hannah, do you want to jump in on that too?
Yeah, just, I mean, let me go back to 2030. I mean, Kate, I hear you. And I mean, I think it's important to know that the modeling shouldn't be aspirational. It should be realistic. And so we, I think when we set the goal in 2020, we saw a takeoff in EVs. We thought the market would move more quickly. The pandemic did slow that down. The trajectory is not where it needs to be to hit the goal we set in 2020 of 219,000 vehicles on the road. So I think we had to adjust this based on the hydrogen conversation last week, but I still think 150 is a pretty significant uptick compared to where we are now. And so I think we want our modeling to be, this is still a big transition for Maine people. This is a lot more EVs on the road than we have now in the next 5 to 6 years. So I think all of the strategies we put in the plan will help us achieve that. And if I will just say, we set a goal in 2020 around heat pumps and we exceeded it. We all feel great about that. That was a lot of hard work and we would love to exceed these goals. But if our modeling is aspirational, I think it's not realistic, because we are required by law to set goals that we think are realistic based on the trajectory we're on now. So just don't mean to pile on, but that's, I think, again, everyone help us exceed this goal. But I think 150 is slightly above where we were a week ago, which was 135,000 EVs on the road. But it is still going to be a lot of work to get there.
Right. Kathleen.
I really appreciate that reminder, Hannah, of like where the aspiration is and where the realism is. And just know that all those strategies are building towards this, but there's also a piece of the implementation that, how do we keep our shoulder behind all of these strategies, and how do we push when the market is not moving, is not just naturally taking us there. And so I just want to make sure that we don't lose sight of those opportunities that we have and that we have to take to move Maine people where we need to go to hit these targets, so that we aren't in 4 years saying, well, that one we thought it was realistic, but it turns out it was aspirational, so we'll dial it down. We're going to need to keep dialing it up.
Kate, you want to have one last word on this, and then let's see if there's other reactions?
I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you, Commissioner and Director Pingree. I I have another idea, and I'll sit down with Sarah, but I do think this last little bit of the conversation with the heat pump example is actually really important, because it is a place where we've seen private sector, public sector, philanthropic sector come together to say we have to get this done. So, perhaps it's a call to action, because to couple with the education language, as I said in a couple meetings ago, education only gets us so far if there aren't implementing techniques that really get at least hybrids into the hands of people who need to travel in this state. And I want to make sure that people can get to work as well. So it's more of a call to action. And as I said, David, it's not going to cause me to vote no on this.
I appreciate you bringing that up, Kate, and I appreciate that nuance too.
And just, can I just add one more? Just, I do think, I know Joyce is out there and Bruce Van Note's on the call. Jeff Crawford is here. Transportation Working Group really did spend a lot of time thinking about those strategies to help increase awareness, to more fully embrace both plug-in hybrids and EVs, knowing that both types of vehicles significantly reduce our emissions and help us meet our goals. So I will just say, I think 4 years ago we were in a let's try to get there. I think we've had the reality of the last 4 years as we have successfully deployed charging, continue to do that. Lots of education, public safety education, all the things. So I would say this plan is much more detailed and specific about how we get there. And I just really am, I know you've all read the many details in this report, but they did double down in many more, I would say, detailed ways than compared to where we were 4 years ago.
Great. I want to check in and see if there are other questions or reactions to this, these updated targets. Anything else that's jumping out at folks that you think it's really important to check in on before we sign off on all this? Okay. Great. All right. So we can drop the slides for the moment, I think. So this is sort of, we're getting to that place where you as a council need to say, you know what, I'm okay. Let's let this thing walk forward, right? Given all of the feedback you provided last week and before, the changes that have been made, the hard work of all the working groups like Hannah just mentioned, that you're looking at this and you're like, you know what, it's doing it. I might not like everything in there, right? There may be some things that I'm not thrilled about, but as a package, it's okay to move forward, get it in the hands of the designers, the copy editors, make it look pretty, and let's go celebrate this next month. So before we do that, I'm just going to show like what we talked about earlier. So again, these are my raw notes. Apologies, everyone. We've talked about 4 things that would be sort of updates to what you have in your hands right now. One is a shout out to the 3D printing that's happening right now, home printing at Maine. Another is a shout out to additional federal funding opportunities Dan Burgess mentioned. Another is add a little bit more flavor to the line on thermal networks and about how you would implement. And I don't understand it well enough, but Dan Burgess and Michael Stoddard do. And so have them go write a clause that gets at that point. And then the final piece around a mention of an emerging pest, and do that as one of several examples of pests and forest health stuff. And Amanda, Tom, and Pat could do that, such as clause when we talk about pests and invasives and things. So those are the 4 things that I've heard mentioned that would be different than what you have in your hands, in addition to what we looked at in the building code one that I showed you earlier, which is a little different than what's in the document right now. Okay, so I guess my question to you all is, are we there, right? Did we do it? Are we comfortable? And can we live with this? And if there's some things that we need to shout out about, let's shout out now and see if we can fix them in real time. Deborah?
Yeah, thanks. This is really great, and all of you are the real experts, so thank you for all the incredible work. The only thing that I would, and maybe this is coming, is I think it was really terrific that we had the information about the progress. I think the more that could be summarized and shared, I think that would be really valuable. I don't know if we can have a few bullet points on that, or if that's intentional, or if that's intentional for press or just for others. But there's been great progress, and I think it'd be nice to be able to very clearly and quickly articulate that rather than have to read through all the wonderful paragraphs and summarizing of progress.
And
Right. So go ahead, Hannah.
yeah, no, and Deborah, that's an excellent point. I will just say, when we released our first plan in 2020, we'd never done it before. We put these benchmarks out there. And then every year after that report, we, on December 1, released a progress report of where we are. This December 1, or in this case, November 21st, because we all are going to do it early so we can have a wonderful Thanksgiving. On November 21st, we're going to release a plan, but also report on progress of where we are. So just to say that throughout the chapters, there are updates on progress, because we're basically trying to combine these two things to show we've made a lot of progress in 4 years. But we will also release the dashboard of where we are on the metrics that we've set. So
thank you.
I would say the messaging and the public reporting on November 21st will be doing a lot of heavy lifting, but it will try to do both things. So you're absolutely right, Deborah.
Okay.
We do want to continue to emphasize that this isn't just another new plan. This is really, honestly, a plan that kind of tweaks the strategies that we set out in 2020, and we want to report on where we are. So I think that's a helpful comment, but just know that that is what we hope and plan to do with all your help.
Perfect. Thank you. As a relative newcomer, I wasn't aware of all that. So thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Deborah. Helpful. Michael, go ahead, please.
I have a pretty detailed question about a recommendation in the building section, and I was frantically trying to communicate with Melanie offline. It's just very narrowly described as being about natural gas, and I just want to see if that was intentional. So this is there's a regional initiative that Melanie knows about, and some stakeholders brought this to our attention, and I think Melanie's staff also knows about it and is participating in it. And it's looking at setting standards for, I think, if I'm recalling correctly, just generally for all kinds of appliances. And it's looking at doing that with setting emissions standards. So it's something that all the states have been looking into. And I just want to see if the way it's phrased here and its specific reference to natural gas is on purpose, and we like that, or do we want to be more generic about low carbon emissions generally? So I'm sorry to spring this at the very 11th and 59th minute, but I thought I should ask before it becomes locked in.
Can you say where that is exactly, Michael? Sorry.
It's in in the draft on page 11, which is recommendation number 1 about weatherization and heating systems, and it's the second to last bullet. It's pretty well described in the body, but when it was summarized, it calls out gas-fired hot water systems, and I just want to be sure that's really what we mean. We want to be that specific. I had the understanding that it was a more open-ended initiative that was looking at a variety of heating systems and also a variety of fuels. So that's my question.
I think Kathleen may want to weigh in as well, but yes, Michael, what you just described is consistent with, I would agree with your sort of suggested adjustments to expand what this might cover, that this was not intended to be, I mean, at least as I understand sort of the strategies that are being considered and which kinds of equipment we would like to see be improved upon, that it's not just about natural gas fired units. Absolutely, because we have so few of those really in Maine that we would want to look at all of the opportunities related to improving, residential hot water heating options.
Okay, so broaden that out so it's not so narrow, but it gets at a sort of broader set of opportunities on.
I think it would be easy to redraft just to make it more generic
Yeah.
and because the main point is to keep participating in the initiative.
Right.
And the initiative will go where it goes. I think it's looking at a broad range of things. I see Dan has a hand up and he might have some insight on this too. So I'm
Same page, different, but same page, but different item.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so hang on. So on this item, the recommendation is make it more general. Does anybody have a concern with doing what Melanie and Michael say for this particular bullet point and make it more general so it's not quite so dialed in specific? Great, let's do that. Okay.
Thank
super.
you.
Yeah, thanks for that catch, Michael. Dan?
Thanks. And the bullet above on sales tax exemption, this is in the buildings group, but now as I'm reading it, I realize that with Michael and Kathleen, is the discussion around a sales tax exemption only for folks that are using it for heating and cooling, or was it a broader sales tax? Because that wouldn't necessarily capture, one, I'm not sure how you might know, and two, that wouldn't capture electric vehicle charging at home.
Well,
Maybe
because we were in the
wordsmith some of
buildings, because we were in the buildings group, we were mostly thinking about home heating and cooling, but mostly home heating and water heating. So, we were, I think, trying to stay in our lane, and I also think we weren't sure how it could be accomplished. We recognized that there would be some challenges to that. And so I happen to know that in the past, the utilities and somebody at some point must have made a calculation about what a kind of a default level of electricity use would be, because there's already a portion of your electric load that is tax exempt. I think it's the first 750 kWh of consumption monthly. So I'm guessing somebody said, well, that's about as much as you might need to, heat your home. But if you want to go bigger, then that's going to be taxable. And I just think we could come up with some conventions and some assumptions, knowing the average amount of heat that a home uses and how much it would take to heat it with electric. We could come up with something. Maybe that's just not possible. I don't know, but that was a detail we recognized we weren't going to be able to figure out at this stage.
Do we need to do anything to this, knowing that there is some, there's a whole bunch of implementation steps that would need to happen in that detail, but are we comfortable with the way it is written right now?
If I might, just A, yes, I'm comfortable the way it's written now. B, just to Dan's second question, the distinction between EVs and heating systems is that if you go out and buy a gallon of gas, you are going to pay tax on that. Whereas if you go out and buy a gallon of heating oil, you pay zero tax on that. So that seems unfair that seems like an unlevel playing field for people who are heating with electric. Whereas if you pay some kind of tax on it for your EV, that's a different issue.
Okay. I just advocate to keep as is, if you can live with that, Dan.
Yeah, sounds good. I just the implementation of it we'll need to talk about, as Michael mentions. That sounds good.
Super. All right. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay. Anything else of that ilk, of like a quick catch, or something that's standing in the way of you saying, I can live with this, and I look forward to celebrating it on November 21st? Anything else? Noel? Hang on one second, Noel, you're still on mute.
Good morning, everyone. It's the section on page 78, and this I think I can live with it, and I'd be able to celebrate it on the 22nd. But I just wanted to bring it up. I mean, the section about engaging youth in climate action, I'm wondering we should also mention older adults, which is our largest demographic in the country, in the state, and to actually then dedicate resources and consciously commit to, like, bringing older adults on board as well. We mentioned it in the previous section a little bit, but not necessarily here. And I'm wondering if we should actually add and older adults in climate action.
Great. Let me see if I can get to that. I feel like my pages are different than everybody else's pages. Let me get there in a second. Can you just read what it says right now, Noel?
Sure. Sorry, just give me a second.
I see it.
Yeah.
I got it. Wow. Hang on a second.
It's page 76 of I think the PDF folks have received. Maybe I'm looking at an old one. So it's
Okay.
continue to engage with Maine youth to support climate action. And
Yeah, that's it.
this was more to reflect kind of the effort, that the sort of interest that youth have had, the participation in the working groups. But Noel, I totally hear you. And we've had very, I think, good conversations about just the importance on resilience and all kinds of other issues to engage older adults. So I love to hear what others think, but
Kathleen, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think absolutely we want to bring all Maine people along on this. And I appreciate calling out youth as a group that might not naturally find their way into the Climate Council process, into the implementation of the Climate Action Plan. We are all on this group incredibly young and spry, but older adults do tend to have a representation in government that youth don't. And so I think that's how I read this section, is calling that out as something that we have to be especially thoughtful about, because it won't just happen.
And if I may, not that we're looking for extended discussion on this, Kathleen, I feel like a lot of older adults that I work with don't know much about climate action and don't really engage with it, right? And so I do agree with you completely that in terms of who's represented on the council and the work that's been happening, we're not young, college students and young in that sense, but generally speaking, at large, the community at large, when we look at that, I'm not sure older adults are on board as we would like for them to be. Yeah. So, like I said, I'd be happy either way, but I wanted to point it out.
No, thank you. And I think it's like we need everybody to be involved, right? We need everybody. And so let's do that.
I wonder if there's a place, and maybe it's not this place, but there's a place in this document where there can be a shout out to older adults. And I wonder if we want to just, Hannah, if you feel like if you had the mandate from the council here, you could go in and find that place to do that shout out.
yeah, I mean, I think, Noel and I have talked a fair amount about this, and I think there is some specific outreach, and it may require different communications as well as sort of, we'll say, like extra communications. I think we could add either a bullet to the youth section and sort of broaden that, or put it in the strategy above about specific project to engage with older adults in Maine. So I think if folks are not objecting to this, we could work on some language to add it. I don't think this is a highly controversial, and obviously it's a really good thing to try to do. So.
Okay. Any concerns with finding a place, whether it's where I'm showing now or lower down, finding a place to do a specific shout out to the importance of engaging older adults in this work? Okay, great. So I just added it to my list. Stacy?
Thank you so much. Good morning. I have a concern about page 49 at the top. It's bullet point number. It's a set of bullet points labeled number 1. It's about working lands, natural and working land solutions.
Okay.
Under the bullet point around farmland action plan, I think we need to increase the language, tweak the language a little bit to talk about ongoing dedicated funding for this work. Developing a dedicated funding source. Also making sure that there's a bucket here for us to receive federal dollars for this work. And then in the subgroup, we had spoken about the idea of no net loss of farmland by the year 2030. And I would really love that to be mentioned in here as well, just to make sure we're stating our goal. And then it goes on page 50 with some narrative. So we'll want to make sure we tuck it in there as well.
Okay. All right, so let's get specific if that's okay. And I apologize, for some reason the document I have is completely different pagination.
I was gonna say,
But
Page 49, I mean, just to, Stacy, the bullet, and hopefully Tom and Amanda are out here.
It's strategy E.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at develop a Maine farmland action plan to safeguard the state's agricultural resources by doubling permanently protected farmland in Maine by 2030. Establish a new state program that focuses on funding farmland conservation. That's sort of in addition to the permanent funding for conservation programs, which is broad, but obviously the chapter details the priority areas the working group came up with. So, sorry, just Tom and Amanda, are you out there? And Stacey, will you repeat again? You'd like to see.
I would like to have it be more specific around establishing a dedicated funding source that's ongoing for farmland conservation.
So we have this, establish permanent funding for existing new land conservation programs. So,
yeah, the rub historically has been that we only have 3% of Maine's farmland and conservation out of the 22% of Maine's lands. So what if we're going to meet our food goals, we need to be able to prioritize farmland because we are losing it at a relatively high rate currently.
And Stacey, part of what you're suggesting, we do have established a new state program that focuses on funding farmland conservation, but you want to strengthen those words.
Yes, please.
And to reflect what the working group suggested and add in the working group recommendation was just confirm, I don't know, confirming with you, and I know Melissa was on it and others mentioning that the working group recommended no net loss of farmland by, you said 2030.
Correct.
Tom, Amanda, this is, I think, just adding in words that were part of the working group report. Tom, how do you feel about that?
Are we talking about adding in words to bullet 3 then?
Or that it could be the description. It doesn't have to all go into the strategy, but it would be added into the narrative. I think that Stacy would like to have establish a new state program that focuses on funding farmland conservation. She wants more clarity around, did you say ongoing?
Dedicated.
Yeah, and I think to Stacey's point, it's not necessarily assumed that it's all state funding, that there are other potential sources of funding out there that could be part of the picture. But I understand what she's saying. I think, it makes sense. We don't want to just establish a program and not fund it, because sometimes that happens.
Got it. Okay, so that particular line about establishing a new state program is right here, right? So it's establishing a new state program that focuses on and provides dedicated funding to support it or something. So that's the kind of language.
Identifies funding sources, something along those lines, to make it a little broader, I think.
Got it.
And she mentions we could, in the paragraphs following, I'm just looking to you, Amanda and Tom. The working group, just confirming, recommended no net loss of farmland by 2030, bringing those words into here. Is that something you can live with?
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. So I added 2 of my sort of punch list of things that need to happen in this document that we're all agreeing should happen. The 2 there is talking about identifying funding sources at the back end of the sentence I'm highlighting. And the second is no net loss. In the paragraphs below, talk about no net loss of Maine farmland. Okay. Great. Thanks, Stacy. All right. So, all right. Paige?
Yeah, hi everyone. Paige Nichols, Department of Ed. Just wondering, in looking through the intro section, I think it begins on page 11 through 13, if there's where it talks about bringing climate education to all Mainers, I believe, a place to weave in. I really appreciate the edits that have been made to include public education throughout the document. And I wonder if it's a missed opportunity maybe there not to mention the importance of including the next generation in the climate action work, and thinking that that may be a place for that. It's not really a mention in that intersection of the role that public education plays in preparing the next generation to be part of the work.
I would just say, Paige, the team did a fantastic job bringing this sort of intro section together quickly for you all to read. And I was looking at that sort of the 4 goals we put in the intro. The 4 goals are reducing emissions, resilience, jobs and economy, and then engaging Maine people. And I would just say that I agree with you, and I actually think that kind of ensuring that we kind of talk about that engagement. And I would just say, broadly, we've talked about older Mainers and youth. I think we can strengthen that language if folks are okay with that. So I think that's a good suggestion.
Great.
Thanks, Hannah.
Okay. Anything else? So here's my punch list. Let me share again, it's suffers from the fact it's my real-time typing and trying to pay attention as well. So these are the bullets that you all have said would be changes that you all agree to in a new version of this, or a slightly updated version. The updated code language we talked about, I mentioned the 3D homes. We've been through these ones, right? Since we've last looked at this, I just named, this isn't a change, but it's just a reminder on the communications around this, or on the clear message on the progress to date. Hannah described how they're going to plan to do that. On buildings first recommendation, there's a bullet that's too specific and needs to be more general about gas-fired hot water heaters. And we can make that more general. We can find a place somewhere in that education outreach section to make a specific shout out to older adults and their role in climate action. What we just talked about in the farmland, this doesn't say farmland in this bullet, but that's what this is all about, is about farmland. And when we talk about that new state program, we make some mention of identifying funding sources for that. And also in that same section, talk about the goal of no net loss of Maine farmland. And then just what we talked about in the intro, strengthen language on youth and older Mainers.
Okay, public education. Yep.
In public education. Great. So that's what I have, folks. Just checking with those changes. Bruce Van Note, you just raise your hand. Go ahead, please.
Hi, everybody. I wondered if this made the typo level, but was advised that it didn't. And just to change on page 19 regarding active transportation corridors, we set a goal of 10 miles, and it's just the label of it. It says high priority corridors, and the actual label we're going to be using here when we map it is priority corridors. And the third bullet below that on page 19 says that we're going to be mapping priority corridors. So my suggested change is really just definitional, not substantive. Labeling that we delete the word high in the third hollow bullet at the top of page 19.
Great. That's easy. Thanks for that catch.
Yep. Thank you.
All right. So with these changes, are folks comfortable moving forward? Chris Kessler?
Hey, good morning, everybody. I wanted to suggest a piece tying in two different sections of the report. We had mentioned in section B a little blip about home repair to get buildings ready for weatherization. and also on PDF page 66, it's number 4 in that section to help Maine people prepare their homes, schools, and businesses for climate change. And it mentions a little bit about getting some extra assistance to invest in health and safety remedies. I think it would be great to just give a little bit more emphasis to that home repair concept in that section as well, and lift that up more. I don't know exactly how the wording would go, but I would personally really like to see that.
Okay.
Just clarify, Representative Kessler, and I'm looking at Dan Brennan too. I mean, this is sort of identifying the often pre-weatherization need that we have heard is pretty urgent. So you're just trying to emphasize that a little bit more across these two sections.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, no objection to that. I had thought, I'm looking at two different versions, sorry.
Yeah.
I had thought we had covered that. It clearly is in the it's clearly in our minds and a very important thing, and the representative has touched on that. I think I just need a little help how to do that, but clearly the idea that we have homes that need weatherization that we can't weatherize because we don't have the pre-weatherization repairs, we call weatherization readiness funding.
I just grabbed the text that I thought, and I'm not sure, Chris, if you're talking about something else in addition to this text, but this is what we have right now with a shout out to the importance of pre-weatherization work.
Yeah, on the PDF page 66, it goes in. It's the well, the fourth paragraph. It talks about providing assistance to invest in health and safety remedies and mold abatement and prevention. But really emphasizing the home repair aspect in that paragraph and the bullet on that number 4, I think would be important.
That's in the resilience section, sort of the public health mention.
Yes, I see it in the resilience section. Okay.
Is there any, I mean, it seems relevant and overlapping, so to carry forward some of that similar recommendation.
Right, so have it that kind of talk about the importance of pre-weatherization work can go into that resilience part as well.
Yes, and I I always think about waterproofing and preventing flooding in homes as like one of those huge things. So, but just wanted to call that out.
I think if nobody objects, I do think that seems fine to put in that sentence, just to reemphasize that not just the actions, but the pre-home repair activities that allow those actions to move forward. That does make sense.
Okay. Any concerns about that, counselors?
Thank you, everybody.
Great. Okay. All right. So with that, are we okay moving forward? Stacy?
Thank you. Sorry, I have one more question. I'm wondering if there's any way to make some sort of larger statement or provide some page with a narrative that speaks to the good work of the materials management, waste management subgroup. And their work is sprinkled throughout the plan, but something that sort of more clearly states the goals and the understanding of the role that waste management and reduction of waste plays in this climate mitigation story.
Because it got spread out, is there a way to do a shout out? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. I wonder, Melanie or Hannah, if you feel like this could be one of these things, because it got spread out across the document, maybe there is a little shout out, a little box or something that's like, hey, this is really important. We can call it trash.
Yeah, thanks, David. I was thinking that as well, and particularly related to also the land use intersecting issues group that we had. So we had two groups that provided quite a bit of input on issues that, spread across multiple of these sort of policy and issue areas. And I haven't looked at the document to see what might be the right landing place for that, but we probably should acknowledge and make sure we've got inclusion of that somewhere, that these were additional intersecting issue groups that contributed to the work of, the substance of this plan that we have in front of us now.
Great. Okay.
So I guess that would be we agree with you, Senator Brenner. Sorry. But as long as you trust us to figure out how to incorporate it. I mean, we'll have acknowledgements at the end. There's a letter from the co-chairs at the beginning, so we will find a place because we completely agree with you.
Super. Thanks for bringing it up, Stacy. Commissioner Beal.
Yeah, I know we're trying to move on, but I'm hoping that we can just jump back to section or strategy E for just a moment. Trying to figure out just a couple of things here. One is really appreciate the comment that Pat raised, and it made me realize that one of the things that I think we definitely do need to add is some kind of an overarching comment about invasives and pests, relative to climate. And I think it could be something as, broad as climate change is increasing risks from pests, invasive species, and disease on the state's natural and working lands. And I could put that in chat if that's helpful. And I would leave it up to the staff to figure out where it belongs. But I just think we need to acknowledge that somewhere. And there was something not quite as descriptive in the original climate action plan that did point to pests. So I don't think it's out of keeping for us to just keep that front and center for folks. But I think Tom maybe had a more targeted suggestion about Pat's comment. Maybe I'll turn it over to him and I'll just type what I just said into the chat. And then, like I said, I'm fine with staff figuring out where that would best fit if folks are amenable to that.
Yeah, that's great. And man, I'm just showing on the screen, it's in the sort of opening description, like page 4 of the document mentions it. So it would be reasonable to have that echo lower down if you want to do the line like you're saying, have that echo lower down in E somewhere as well.
Yeah, and actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think because the title of E is now lands and waters, right? There might need to be some kind of an acknowledgement to invasives in the aquatic environment, but just something that captures that as a challenge going forward.
Great. Okay.
I'll put what I
Yeah.
said in the chat, but I think it could be improved.
Okay.
And
Yeah, I mean, I don't
David,
see, I think sorry, Melanie, Amanda, that makes sense. And as long as folks can live with factual statement that is clear about the risks, and I do know the marine sector is facing many of the same, so it might be a couple of sentences. We also, I can't remember exactly what's in the STS overview at the beginning, but we can think about making sure it's clear in that, in both the chapter on natural working lands and waters, as well as that science overview.
Yeah, and I'm really just putting the sentiment forth. And again, like I said, maybe it can be improved by the staff.
Great. Tom,
And
were you trying to jump in there
yeah,
as well?
David, specific to Pat's comment, I think we might be able to shoehorn that in at the end of page 51. The paragraph around monitoring for forest carbon, and specifically the sentence that starts with "it would continuously," and there's kind of a list of things that would happen there, and we could add in forest pests.
Great. Are you all right if we just leave that in your hands to do that?
Yeah.
Super. Thanks, Tom. I'm glad you're in there looking for that opportunity. Okay. All right. So we've added to our list of things, we've added some shout outs on the role of waste management and the role of land use. Those are the cross-cutting things that ended up populating across the document. We're going to add a sentence or two on the impacts of climate on invasive species and pests, both land and water. Tom just gives a heads up on how we're going to potentially do what we talked about earlier on spruce budworm. Okay. How are we feeling? Are we ready? Are we ready to talk about next steps and say yes to this? Does anybody have a concern saying yes to with these changes incorporated? Okay. Sometimes silence is beautiful. All right. I want to thank everybody. It's hard work to have such a beefy document. And so thank you all for doing that, detailed read, and really appreciate it. So with that, congratulations. You have the core of your updated climate action plan for the state of Maine. The writing team now has, the sprint to the end on doing a beautiful formatting, doing the copy editing, all that good stuff. I'm going to turn it back to Hannah and Melanie to walk us through next steps in getting to November 21st and what we're going to do on November 21st.
Great. Well, and David, I just want to make very clear to everybody on the Zoom screen, I think the process of the climate action plan is we seek consensus, and we have worked through lots of concerns and changes, but just to be very clear, the next step is we take this draft, which you've all helped wordsmith and adjust based on your feelings, and we turn it into a climate plan. And our plan is to launch on November 21st. Again, usually we do it December 1, but that's a Sunday after Thanksgiving. So we're going to all have a very nice and relaxing Thanksgiving, having put the climate plan out on November 21st. So you have that date on your calendar. We're still working on details of that event, but we will continue to fix and edit this document based on your suggestions and have it ready by that date. So honestly, I'm going to also, Molly is out there. I just actually at this point want to say, this is a point of thank yous. This climate plan, it sort of seems we're tying it up in a neat bow. There's still lots of wordsmithing and fixing and some copy editing and a very heavy lifting for a graphic designer coming up in the next couple weeks. But this is the product of now years of work among working groups. We've showed you how many meetings we've all had, and I hate to judge things in meetings, but it is a lot of hard work by literally hundreds of people. Then staff who have spent, and I will say staff in state government, staff in my office and Melanie's office, the governor's energy office, and every other agency, lots of citizens who've engaged. This has been a real heavy lift and a ton of work. So I will just say, I want to just put a big thank you to everyone on the Climate Council and in the working groups and the leadership of all the working groups and task forces and subcommittees. It's kind of a little anticlimactic to just sort of agree by consensus on a Zoom screen. So hopefully we can celebrate a little bit together on November 21st. But I just want to say that this is a lot of heavy lifting. It's a lot more heavy lifting when it comes to continuing to implement all these strategies. But I just want to thank everybody for the time and effort you've put in. The amount of times some of you have read these documents and helped wordsmith these documents is significant. And really, we will hopefully celebrate slightly on November 21st, but also, it's the time period in which we recommit ourselves to making all these things happen. And that is really the heavy work of many detailed strategies across communities in Maine, across state government, across lots of partners in the business and nonprofit sector. So you all know this, but I just really want to thank everyone and everyone else involved for helping us to get to this place, especially Molly, Sarah, and so much of the GoPIP team, and also to David Plum and his team. I think they do a lot in front of you, but also behind the scenes. So I don't want to, again, this is not the victory lap yet, but just want to acknowledge we're in a good place, and it's because of so much heavy lifting by all of you and your teams, but also the staff team that's helped to make this all happen. So
wonderful. So I think with that, we're done for this morning, and we'll see each other in a few weeks' time in person. I've got nothing else to say except thanks everyone for hanging in there. It's a bit of a sweat. Public process is tricky, so thank you all for doing that. And see you in a few weeks. If I were in person, I'd do some like round of applause. A little kind of doesn't really work on Zoom, but it's really great. I mean, honestly, it's phenomenal. So thank you all. And we'll see you in person. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.